One of the greatest battlefield commanders ever, Napoleon Bonaparte created an empire that stretched across the whole of Europe. But he was more than just a soldier. His legal reforms and social policies transformed and rationalised his nation, and many are still in place today. But how did a hot-tempered lad from Corsica rise from humble origins to become Emperor of the French? And how was he brought low to die powerless and alone on a tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic?
Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the complex personality of one of history's most intriguing characters. Was he just a power-crazed megalomaniac, drunk on his own success yet always thirsty for more? Or was there a subtler side to the man who history holds responsible for 20 years of war and the loss of 6 million lives?
Napoleon was born in Corsica in 1769. If it had been a year earlier, he wouldn't have been French at all, but a citizen of the Republic of Corsica, which had freed itself from centuries of rule by Genoa. But France invaded and annexed Corsica when he was still in his mother's womb. His father, a minor noble, fought against French rule, but after the resistance was crushed, he switched sides to become a representative of the island at the court of Louis XVI. The boy who was to become Emperor of the French didn't actually speak French, but Corsican, a variant of Italian, and his name wasn't Napoleon Bonaparte, but Napoleone Bonaparte. Napoleone had a quick temper and was always fighting. Other children in the streets of Ajaccio, and his older brother Joseph, and he had to be firmly disciplined by his mother to keep him in check. Towards the end of her life, his mother recalled that even at the age of 2, she had noted in him un esprit de principauté, a spirit of mastery, describing him as irritable, self-assertive, quarrelsome, violent, quick in sizing up human situations and in responding, and intensely competitive, but also affectionate and remorseful. Quite a personality for a 2-year-old, but this was written more than a decade after his death, when the cult of Napoleon was in full swing, so I think we can take this with a pinch of salt. His mother also revealed that she breastfed all her children except the infant Napoleon, who was put out to a wet nurse.
As you can probably imagine, this simple biographical detail has been pounced upon by psychoanalytically minded biographers to explain his entire personality. His whole life, the countless battles and conquests, his determination never to be beaten at any cost, was all down, apparently, to his mother denying him her breast.
At the age of 9, he was sent to the French mainland and enrolled in a religious school. But a few months later, he was awarded a scholarship to a military academy at Braine-le-Château, 100 miles east of Paris. This was one of 12 schools established in France to prepare boys from poorer backgrounds for military service. They were deliberately austere. Small, unheated cells, no visits from parents, long days and no holidays for 5 years. Cut off from his family, struggling to learn French for the first time, and mercilessly bullied, he initially retreated into himself. He had only 1 or 2 friends and constructed a secret bower for himself in the gardens, where he could be alone. He learned to control his temper and devote himself to his studies. His teachers regarded him as the most able mathematician, and he was an avid reader. Later at Brienne, he fought one of his first battles, a colossal 10-day-long snowball fight, complete with fortifications and rules of engagement. Teams of boys took it in turn to attack or defend the bastion. And in his memoirs he wrote, "Of course I was always the leader, whether on the side of the attackers or the defenders, and I contrived such skillful plans that victory always remained with my side." At the age of 15, he won a place at the École Militaire, or the military college in Paris, where he trained to become an artillery officer. After only a year, instead of the usual 2 or 3, he passed the certifying examination and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Artillery. So began the military career of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was diligent in his duties and well regarded by his seniors. And in his free time, he read everything he could get his hands on: history, politics, philosophy, drama. He remained a passionate Corsican nationalist and wrote an essay questioning how a man could go on living when his country is subdued and he's condemned to live among a people whose vain and corrupt manners are so different to his own. He returned home to his family when he had leave, and he began writing a history of Corsica. And then, on the 14th of July, 1789, when Napoleon was 19, a crowd attacked the Bastille fortress in Paris, crumbling symbol of royal authority, igniting the French Revolution and setting in motion events which would plunge Europe into 20 years of war.
I wonder what would have happened to the little Corsican if there had been no revolution.
A middle-ranking career in the army, a writer perhaps. Maybe he would have done great things in France's Louisiana territory in America. But happen it did, and Napoleon returned to Corsica, where there was fighting between the nationalists, those supporting the king, and those supporting the revolution. Napoleon tried to join the nationalist Pasquale Paoli, who had led the resistance against the Genoese and then the French 20 years previously. But Paoli didn't like him. He was overconfident and the son of a collaborator. In early 1793, Napoleon was part of a force of Corsican volunteers involved in the attempted but disastrous invasion of Sardinia. And in the recriminations that followed, Napoleon had a final split with Paoli, and the entire Bonaparte family was expelled from the island to mainland France. So, just like his father, Napoleon, the passionate Corsican, switched sides, and abandoning any nationalist sympathies, now threw himself squarely into the French Republican cause. By this time, mid-1793, not only was France at war with half of Europe, but there were uprisings in several large cities and the country was in a state of civil war.
Plenty of opportunities for an ambitious young officer to prove himself.
He was involved in the capture of Avignon, and afterwards he wrote a pro-republican pamphlet, Supper at Beaucaire, an account of a meal he had with 4 merchants, in which he sets out reasons why all citizens should support the Republic. It was noticed at the highest level, and he was rewarded with a promotion. Next was Toulon, a key port city which had 1/3 of the entire French naval fleet sitting in its harbour. Royalists had gained control and asked for help from the British and Spanish, who answered their call with ships and 13,000 troops. The Republic had to reclaim it quickly if it was going to survive. Napoleon arrived in Toulon with the rest of the army and immediately set about securing additional guns and supplies. He suggested a bold strategy to his seniors of capturing a hill where his guns could dominate the key passage between the 2 parts of the harbour, essential for resupplying the larger ships. After a series of fierce battles in which he was bayoneted in the thigh by a British soldier, the city was retaken, and the British and Spanish forced out, but not before they managed to burn or capture most of the French fleet. Napoleon's efforts caught the attention of the Committee of Public Safety, and at the age of 24 he was promoted to Brigadier General and put in charge of the artillery of France's Army of Italy.
If that seems extraordinarily young, we must remember that almost all of the pre-revolution officers were from the nobility and had either fled to join royalist armies in exile or been executed in the Reign of Terror, so the Republic was desperate for officers.
Napoleon's artillery was successful in battles in northern Italy, and he was then sent to Genoa to determine its intentions towards France. It was a politically complex time. The revolution in France, and especially the execution of Louis XVI and his Austrian wife Marie Antoinette, had sent shockwaves throughout the royal palaces of Europe, and a coalition of Austria and Prussia was formed, later joined by Britain, Russia, Portugal, Spain, the German states of the Holy Roman Empire, the kingdoms of Naples and Sardinia, and the Dutch Republic. In other words, pretty much the whole of Europe, apart from Genoa, which hadn't yet made up its mind. But then, in Paris, the radical Robespierres were ousted, and Napoleon was arrested because of his association with them. It wasn't for long, however, and he was soon taking part in an attempt to win back Corsica, which had declared itself an independent kingdom under the protection of the British. The expedition failed, and he was assigned to a lower rank position to fight the civil war in the Vendée. Unable to bear the loss of status, he pleaded poor health and was removed from the list of generals and given a desk job at the Bureau of Topography. This was one of the lowest points in his life, and he contemplated throwing himself in the Seine as it seemed his career was over. He even requested a transfer to the Ottoman Empire to offer his services to the Sultan. Request denied. So he consoled himself by getting engaged to Désirée Cléry, daughter of a wealthy silk merchant, and wrote a tragic romantic novella, Clisson et Eugénie, about a soldier and his lover. But events took over again. Royalists in Paris launched a rebellion against the National Convention, the new Republican government. Needing to move fast, Bonaparte was put in charge of the improvised forces to defend the Tuileries Palace against the Royalist forces, who outnumbered them 6-1. He quickly mustered artillery and fired grape shot into the crowds, killing 1,400 and causing the rest to flee in disarray. Back in favour, Bonaparte was given command of the army of Italy. Shortly afterwards he became romantically involved with Joséphine de Beauharnais, a widow with 2 children, 6 years his senior, and they were married in a civil ceremony in March 1796. 2 days later, he left to take charge of his army and immediately went on the offensive, winning swift victories in battle after battle. His boldness and repeated successes scared the Austrians, who sued for peace, and he returned to Paris in December 1797 a hero. Where next for the all-conquering general? France's ultimate aim was to destroy its biggest rival, Britain, but was only too aware of the superiority of the British Navy. So Napoleon proposed an invasion of Egypt to strengthen its position in the Mediterranean and secure a base from which to attack Britain's lucrative trade with India. He landed in Alexandria with 35,000 men in July 1798. Egypt was effectively a breakaway province of the Ottoman Empire, largely controlled by its own military caste, the Mamluks, and Napoleon tried to portray himself as a pro-Islamic liberator. He won decisive victories, but the entire French fleet was destroyed by Nelson in the Battle of the Nile, and as no one fell for his liberator propaganda, he had to deal with a major revolt in Cairo. He put this down brutally by turning his cannon on the crowds, including those who had taken refuge in the Al-Azhar Mosque. He then headed into the Ottoman province of Syria, modern-day Israel, with infantry, cavalry and camel companies. His attack on Jaffa was particularly savage, and afterwards he ordered his troops to butcher as many as 3,000 prisoners, including women and children, bayoneting them and forcing them into the sea. But he had dangerously overstretched his supply line, so after a failed attempt to take Acre, he turned around and headed back to Egypt. Those of his soldiers who were too unwell to travel from the plague or their wounds, he ordered to be poisoned with opium. The whole expedition was completely pointless, and realizing there was no glory to be got by staying longer, he returned to Paris, where he staged a coup to become first consul. He proposed a new constitution, which effectively made him sole dictator, and this was overwhelmingly confirmed by a popular vote.
And for good measure, he got his brother Lucien to falsify the figure, making him out to be more popular than he was, proving that fake news and electoral fraud is nothing new.
Almost immediately he embarked on a second campaign against the Austrians in northern Italy. In 1802, after a decade of constant warfare, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens, and there was peace in Europe, allowing Napoleon to turn his attention to the French colonies in the Caribbean, especially the lucrative sugar plantations of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. The Republic had abolished slavery in 1794, but Napoleon needed cash to fund his wars, so to his eternal shame he reinstated slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Determined to recapture Saint-Domingue, which had declared its independence under the leadership of former slave Toussaint Louverture, he dispatched a force of 50,000 men. But disease decimated the French army, and after a series of military defeats, they left the island for good. The disastrous expedition convinced Napoleon to sell off the vast Louisiana territory to the United States at 3 cents an acre. A crazy decision for the long-term economics of France, which perhaps more than any other illustrates his short-termism and inability to think beyond the next battle.
He needed cash to refill his depleted treasury, and he didn't care that he was selling off the family silver to get it.
In 1804, in response to a number of intrigues and assassination plots, he proposed making himself emperor, and in a referendum, the public overwhelmingly agreed. In Notre Dame Cathedral, in the presence of the Pope, he was crowned with a replica of Charlemagne's crown. Or rather, he crowned himself. After all, who else but Napoleon had the authority to do so? The uneasy peace with Britain lasted just over a year, and Napoleon began assembling an enormous army in Boulogne, ready for invasion. But another coalition of European powers meant that he had to refocus his plans eastwards. His decisive victory over Russian and Austrian forces at Austerlitz brought Round 3 to an end. But Round 4 began only a few months later, when Prussia declared war. Napoleon launched 180,000 men at the threat, and again won resounding victories. After this, he imposed the continental system, forbidding anyone in the client states he had established around Europe from trading with Britain. But Portugal, heavily reliant on its exports, refused to comply. So yes, you've guessed it, he sent an invasion force to impose his authority, beginning the Peninsular War, which would drag on for 7 long years. In 1809, there was the War of the Fifth Coalition, and although Napoleon eventually came out on top, he was defeated on the battlefield for the first time. And then, in June 1812, Napoleon went to war with Russia. Angry that the Tsar was not sticking to his continental system and was trading with Britain, and very much against the counsel of his advisers, he did the only thing he knew how to do: march his men into battle. By the time he reached Moscow, the Russians had burnt it to the ground, and there was no food and little shelter. He had no choice but to begin the long march back. But uncharacteristically, he dithered for 5 weeks, and bad weather set in. Estimates vary, but of the 450,000 troops who went to Russia, more than 80% did not return. Most of the 150,000 horses perished as well, so he had to abandon his cannon in the snow and mud, and Napoleon's myth of invincibility was now well and truly shattered. Over the next year, the Sixth Coalition closed in on Napoleon and his dwindling army. He was initially offered terms that France would return to its natural boundaries and he would remain emperor, but he refused, clinging on to the fantasy that he could regroup and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But fantasy it was, and by the time Alexander I of Russia led the coalition troops into Paris, Napoleon's Grande Armée was all but gone. He now had no choice but to abdicate, and in his self-pity he took a pouch of opium he had been carrying with him since the long retreat from Moscow. With the intervention of his doctor, however, he survived. The Allies decreed that he be exiled to Elba, an island of 12,000 souls between Corsica and Italy. He was even allowed to keep his title of emperor, although his dominion now consisted of precisely 86 square miles. In his first few months on Elba, he created a small army and navy, developed iron mines, built new roads, issued decrees on farming methods, and overhauled the island's legal and educational system. But after less than a year, he had had enough. Separated from his wife and son, denied the allowance agreed for him, and aware of rumours that he was about to be banished further away, Napoleon crossed back into Europe. His former troops flocked to join him, and without a single shot being fired, the restored King Louis XVIII fled into exile, and Napoleon was back as ruler of France. This time for only 100 days, but long enough to muster an army of 200,000, which he marched into Belgium to suffer defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. He abdicated a second time and tried to get to a port to escape to the United States, but he was soon apprehended. This time he was exiled further away to the tiny island of St. Helena, still one of the most remote places on the planet, more than 1,000 miles from the coast of Africa. And this time there was no pretence of him being an emperor. He was very much under the watchful guard of the British governor. For 6 years he lived in a small bungalow, continually complaining about the damp. He learned English so he could keep himself up to date with world events through the newspapers delivered from London. He wrote his memoirs and a history of Julius Caesar. But time hung heavy for the man of action, and he spent hours playing patience. There were vague plots to rescue him, including one from Texas, where exiled soldiers of the Grande Armée had ideas about creating a Napoleonic empire in America. His health gradually faded, and towards the end he reconciled himself with the Catholic Church. In May 1821 he died of stomach cancer. He was 51. Although he asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, the governor had him interred on St. Helena. However, his remains were later moved to Paris at the request of King Louis Philippe, where he was given a state funeral.
How do we assess figures such as Napoleon when there are so many differing and contrasting views on his life?
Many historians regard him as a destructive force because of the 6 million deaths and economic devastation he caused. Others point out that most of the Napoleonic Wars were started by his enemies and he was merely defending his adopted country. Some suggest that his fatal mistake was overextending himself, and that if he had stopped in 1808, his enemies might have left him alone. Others, focusing on his reforming policies within France, point out that he left a strong legacy of rationalised laws, better education, freedom of religion, and support for science and the arts.
You may have noticed that I've barely mentioned the women in his life.
Because it strikes me that despite all his protestations of love for his Empress Josephine and his tolerance of her infidelities, neither she nor his second wife were all that important to him.
Was he mad? The British public certainly thought so, but they had 500,000 men camped just 20 miles across the Channel, breathing down their necks.
But Napoleon didn't have a mental illness. He contemplated throwing himself in the Seine as a young man in Paris, and took opium at the time of his first abdication, and he may have experienced depression in his exile on St. Helena, but he was never mad in the psychiatric sense. His ambition, though, that was certainly grandiose and ill-judged. He was willing to sacrifice the lives of his men and subjugate people to his will. He was willing to risk everything in a win or lose quest for glory.
But isn't that what emperors do? What they've always done? Maybe it was everybody else who was mad for following such a man.
Almost all of his opponents in the Napoleonic Wars were hereditary monarchs, born to lead their countries and part of a dynasty that was bigger than themselves. Napoleon fought his way to the top and, seizing the opportunities that presented themselves, carried on fighting until there was no one left to fight. The personality traits that give someone the drive to succeed at all costs cannot then be switched off to consolidate and work towards sustainable stability. Napoleon was a fighter. In the streets of Ajaccio as a boy, in his snowball fights at school, and it seems to me that he remained a fighter to the end, bankrupting his country and destroying lives without a second thought in his desire, no more than a desire, need to come out on top. If there is a lesson for us today, I think it is that we should be wary of those who promise greatness and glory on a foundation of shifting sand.
Thank you for watching. I'm not going to put up any pictures of leaders who might fall into that category. You'll have to make your own minds up. If you found this one interesting, please check out some of my other videos and remember to subscribe and click for notifications if you haven't already done so. But I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon.